Back to Anatomy and Physiology on Demand. And this is going to be week 12A, part 3, where we are moving on to the diencephalon and the brainstem and continuing on from there. We are completely done with the cerebrum. So the diencephalon was the second swelling out of the 5 swellings, and so it is deep and completely surrounded by parts of the cerebellum. And so if you want to find the diencephalon, find the corpus callosum and go inferior to that, where you have the oval Easter egg or the duck's head, and that's going to be the thalamus, and then the duck's beak, triangulars, so go to the anterior part of the thalamus and go inferior. That's where you're going to find the hypothalamus. And then posteriorly, there is some structures in something known as the epithalamus, but the only important part of it is the structure known as the pineal gland. So those are the 3 things we're going to be talking about. So starting first with the thalamus, I want you to realize this is gray matter, meaning it has lots of cell bodies in it. And the reason why it does is because a lot of neurons come here carrying special senses, for instance, vision and hearing and equilibrium. They come here, they synapse, and then a neuron goes out and goes to the correct cerebral area. The other interesting thing about the thalamus, if you've ever heard about people who have some kind of major trauma, whether it is a car accident or whether it was watching the horror of 9/11 or whatever it is, and you've seen or you've heard about people going into shock where they like freeze and can't do anything, not shock as in their blood pressure is really low because they have problem with the cardiac output. That's thought to be due to a major sensory overload going into the thalamus, and so the thalamus kind of shuts down until your body can get back at equilibrium. So that's the thalamus. We will come back and talk a lot more about it when we are learning special senses, which is the last topic for this semester. Moving on to the hypothalamus, this is a really important part of the brain, and you'll learn a lot about it in your first organ system in the second semester, and that's the endocrine organ, because it's the hypothalamus that is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And if you recall, it's these 2 organ systems that actually are keeping your body in homeostasis. So the hypothalamus can control some viscera, and one really important role it does is it keeps your temperature within that normal range. And the reason why you have a fever, for instance, if you have a bacterial infection or viral infection, is because chemicals have been released which reset that. And although you may think that's bad for your body, the good part about it is bacteria and viruses, they like to be at normal body temperature. So at 102, they are not going to be proliferating nearly as fast as they will be at your 98, 99 degrees. As far as the pineal gland goes, this is a little endocrine gland here, and it secretes a hormone known as melatonin. Now, if you go back and remember when I talked about the integumentary system, when we talked about melanocytes secreting melanin, and I said some of you were going to write melatonin. Well, it's true, some of you wrote melatonin, but that was melanin, and this is melatonin. Okay. And what melatonin does is it regulates circadian rhythm. So melatonin is something that you can go buy when people travel. They will also often buy melatonin because they think they can get over jet lag faster. But basically, your body's going to get over jet lag at about an hour a day. So if you can like work before you go, move it a couple of hours, and if you get there and then if you're only 3 hours off, you should be fine. It's when you're going to the other side of the world, like from here to India, that it's 12 hours off, that it takes your body quite a bit longer. And you can shift your days at each end to eventually get there. Okay, so those are the 3 important parts of the diencephalon. So now I want to talk to you something that's right next to the diencephalon, but is not part of it, and that is the pituitary gland. And the other name for pituitary gland is the hypophysis. So if we look at the brain from below, the 2 big Easter egg shaped structures, that's the thalamus, and between the 2 is where you would find the 3rd ventricle, and the anterior aspect is where the hypothalamus would be. So that Pineal gland is posterior and the pituitary gland is anterior to it. And also to help you remember, look at the bottom right picture, find the duck's beak for the duck's head for the thalamus, the beak for the hypothalamus, and hanging from the hypothalamus like a cherry on a stalk is going to be the pituitary gland, and it sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So the pituitary gland has a lot of hormones that come out of it. It's got an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And you are going to learn about 9 different hormones that come out of the pituitary gland. So once again, that's going to be first semester, first organ system of the second semester. So starting with your first lecture in the fall. Once we are done with this area of the brain, we are moving downward into the brainstem. And as you learned for lab, there are 3 structural areas of the brainstem. The more superior part is called the midbrain. So to find a midbrain, basically draw a line at the undersurface of the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and then draw a line parallel to it. Find the pregnant belly of the pons. So if you have this and you don't have the cerebellum, the pregnant belly is always anterior, so you know that this part is anterior, and draw a line parallel to it that goes up here. And so the midbrain would be this area. Then the pregnant belly is the pons, but it's also all of this. It's everything below the midbrain that's anterior to the cerebellum. And then the lowest part is going to be the medulla oblongata. The word oblongata was here, but I covered it up with this second picture. Okay. And the brainstem is really important because it has a lot of areas that give us survival, things related to heart rate and blood pressure. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the midbrain. Okay, so the midbrain basically is connecting that diencephalon with the hindbrain, with the metencephalon and diencephalon. And in the middle of the midbrain, we have this little cerebral aqueduct, which is over there. So when I say it connects stuff, what I mean is, remember up above it, thalamus, cingulate gyres, all that limbic stuff, that fear part. And it's also going to connect stuff with involuntary reflexes, as we will learn about later. If you look at the sagittal view of the midbrain where the cerebral aqueduct is, you will notice that there is a lot of midbrain which is anterior to it, and posteriorly you see these 2 little bumps. If you look at it more anteriorly, what you would notice is anteriorly you see all these stripy things that are going in a superior inferior direction. So here's another picture looking at it. This is the anterior surface of the midbrain because there's the pons and there's the medulla oblongata. So the most anterior part of the midbrain is the cerebral peduncles, which are kind of like the little legs that the diencephalon is sitting on top of. And the reason why it looks like things are going up and down or superior inferior is because things are going up and down. We have a lot of tracts. Remember, a tract is a group of axons traveling together within the central nervous system, as opposed to a nerve being a group of axons traveling together in the peripheral nervous system. So we have a lot of tracts that are ascending and descending, connecting the cerebrum with either the spinal cord or the cerebellum. So that's the function of the cerebral peduncle. If we then turn the brain around and we look at it from the posterior aspect, what you would note is that there are 4 little posterior structures, and all 4 together are called the 4 bodies. So quadrigemina is 4, corpus is body. So the corpora quadrigemina. So there are 4 of them. So there are 2 on the right and 2 on the left. And on each of those pairs, 1 is above and 1 is below. So the 2 that are above on the right and the left, each of those is a superiorcolliculus, and the 2 that are below, 1 on the right and 1 on the left, each of those is an inferiorcolliculus. And even though they're right next to each other, they have totally different functions. In the human, they're about the same size to each other, but in the sheep brain, which is something you're not going to get a chance to do, that superiorcolliculus is well, in the first place, it's about 3 times bigger in the tiny little sheep brain than it is in the big human brain. And the superior colliculus is going to be probably 5 to 10 times bigger than the inferior colliculus in the sheep. So then you're asking yourself, well, why is that? What does the superior colliculus do? And what it is, it's a reflex center for when you are following, you're tracking. So imagine the animal needs to track another animal because that's its dinner. Okay? So that's part of the reason why it's so large. For humans, like we will use it like if you're watching a tennis match going back and forth or watching the Grand Prix or something and you're tracking that. Most of the time humans use it because we see something in our peripheral vision and then we kind of turn to it. Otherwise, superior colliculus, not that important in humans, which is why it's so much smaller. Now that's totally in contrast to the inferior colliculus, which has nothing to do with vision, but it has to do with auditory stimuli. Okay, so were you startled by that noise? Because if you did have that startle reflex or fright, because in the class what I usually do is just take a textbook and drop it on the floor, and everybody like has that startle reflex, that's your inferior colliculus. Okay, so for a lesser degree, if you weren't really startled, but because you were taking notes but you looked up to see what was happening, that's the same sort of thing, where the head is turning in response to the sound. So superior colliculus has to do with vision, inferior colliculus has to do with an auditory stimulus. So now what I would like to do is do a cross section between the 2 colliculi and go in a horizontal transverse plane. And so if we would do that, here, superior colliculus right here and inferior colliculus right there, all right? Cerebral aqueduct in the middle, and then this is the anterior aspect, so each of these is the cerebral peduncle. Okay. So stop this if you need to figure out where we are. And what I want to do is I want you to notice this blackish material right here on each side between, it's just posterior to the cerebral peduncles. And that black material is called the substantia nigra, which means the black substance, okay? And what the substantia nigra is, it's the nucleus in the brain. So to remember what a nucleus is, it's where cell bodies are located deep in the brain. So we have cell bodies in the gray matter and the cortex and all the deep parts that contain cell bodies, neuron cell bodies. Each of those is a nucleus. So we already talked about the basal nuclei in the cerebrum. Well, this is a nucleus that's in the midbrain. And that's as opposed to a ganglion, which is in the peripheral nervous system, which is where the cell bodies are located in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so getting back to the substantia nigra. What happens in this area, right here where we have this black substance, this is where we are going to be sending inhibitory motor signals to the basal nuclei or to the thalamus or between the 2. In other words, we are tamping down the motor activity. But here's why they're black. We have some really cool special neurons only found in this area of the brain. So here are the pictures. On the bottom, we have the low power one. And when you look at them, they look brown, just like the melanocytes in the skin look like. And if you look at them on higher power, what you will notice, there's all these little inclusions. And yes, those inclusions all contain melanin. And that's why it has a black color. So these neurons are cool, and that the melanin is actually giving us a visual and chemical target that we can see, we can visualize for the special cells in the midbrain that are producing dopamine, which is a very significant neurotransmitter. So the dopamine is being produced by the neurons in the substantia nigra, and if we have normal levels of dopamine, that gives us an inhibitory motor activity. Okay. Now, here's why we're learning this, because in Parkinson's, in order to get the clinical effects of Parkinson's, you have lost about 80 to 90% of these cells. And so I have 2 cross sections over here. When I was at a different school, I ordered some brains to cut to make sections for students, and I wanted to do a section that showed beautiful substantia nigra. Only I got a picture that like the one on the right, which is not normal. So I had to order a second brain and cut it where you can clearly see some good substantia nigra on the left. So the first one I cut, because we don't get the histories of the patients when we get the brain. And so the first one I cut was obviously somebody who had Parkinson's disease, whereas the one on the left is what a normal person's substantia nigra would look like. Okay, with that, we are done with the midbrain, and we are ready to move on to the pons and the medulla oblongata. So the pons basically has all these tracts. Remember what a tract is? Okay, so all these axons which are connecting the cerebellum, which is posterior, they come into the pons and then they can go down to the medulla. And the pons, as well as the medulla oblongata, have these centers, have these nuclei that are important for regulation of breathing, and respiratory system is a second semester topic. So you'll come back and learn more about that later on. Similarly, the medulla oblongata has functions you will learn about in the second semester, and it is responsible for your pulse rate, as well as whether or not you're breathing, your blood pressure, vomiting, sneezing, coughing, reflexes. And don't forget, the medulla oblongata, the function that we are paying a lot of attention to this semester is, it is in the medulla oblongata that we have that decussation, where descending fibers are going to cross to the opposite side and ascending fibers are going to cross to the opposite side. So left side of the body below the head, right side of the brain, and vice versa. All right. So now let's talk about something which isn't like something you can specifically see on one part of the brain, and that's called the reticular formation or the reticular activating system. I think your textbook is using reticular formation. And what this is kind of some scattered gray matter. In other words, we're going to have some cell bodies of some neurons, but it doesn't form a discrete nucleus that you can see. And it's all throughout all layers of the brainstem. In fact, there's more than 100 different networks here. And the big thing this is important for is it has to do with how alert you are doing. So it definitely has to do with consciousness and sleep. So if you ever have like been studying late at night and you have the TV on and you have the lights on and then you fall asleep, it's because your reticular activating system kind of like turned itself off, which is why when you're tired, if you're driving, like we ask you to get out and rest, but oftentimes what people will do is they'll crank down the windows so they're cold, or they'll turn the radio up really high because the noise stimulates them. Or they might get out of the car and do some jumping jacks just to get their blood going, and then they go back in. So sleep and consciousness, super important. So basically when we're giving you general anesthetic, we are tamponing the messages from here. We are not getting rid of them, because if you had no messages from here, you would be in a coma, which is not the same as general anesthesia at all. In addition to this can modulate some pain messages. Pain is a fascinating thing, and it's way beyond the physiology of this course, but we have lots of different ways that we can change the pain message going into our brain, and this system is one of the ways that we can do that. And the other thing this is good for is it helps you ignore the unimportant stuff, okay? So like, I think the example in the book is like you're sitting there, you're working, you're doing something, and you have all this noise in the background, and then all of a sudden you can pick out like, oh, the baby's crying, okay? But meanwhile, all the other noise wasn't bothering you. You were able to stay onto task. Okay. So now we're done with everything on that side. Let's go posterior to the pons and talk about the cerebellum, which really means little brain, okay? So this, as you can see, it's much smaller than the entire brain. It's about 15% of the size, perhaps. And yet there are more neurons here in the cerebellum than in that entire cerebral cortex. If you look at the cerebellum, it looks like it has a lot of leaves, and all of those are really tiny, really skinny gyri. Okay, which means there's lots and lots and lots of gray matter. And if you look at the cut section over here, you can see the very skinny amount of white matter, that arbor vitae. That's all there is for the white matter. So lots and lots of neurons here. And the basic thing that the cerebellum is important for, it has to do with posture and balance and staying coordinated. It's kind of hard for students to understand this, but if you want to know what it looks like if your cerebellum is not working, watch somebody who's drunk walk, okay? Or have them do the sobriety test where they close their eyes and then like they miss the tip of their nose and something like that. All of this is subconscious, you can't control it. But the cerebellum is super important for your normal motor activity, being nice and smooth and being accurate. Okay, with that, we're done with the brain. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. And then, well, we're not entirely done with the brain, actually, because I'm going to come back and talk about memory later on. But I'm going to put that in the section where we're talking about the spinal cord. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it at this point and give you one more recording.